My name is Sarah O'Keefe, and I will be hosting this webcast today. This webcast comes from a presentation that I originally developed and gave for the STC conference back in May. I've made a few updates here and there, and I have also pulled together a white paper version of this information, which is now available on our website. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. All of you at this point that are in attendance on the call are probably muted, or should be. We do want to take questions. I'm actually quite interested in getting audience participation, but there are a lot of you on the webcast. So the way that we generally do this is through the questions interface. And so if you take a look at your GoToWebinar interface, you'll see a questions area. Exactly what you see depends on what version you're on, but some sort of a questions interface or tab or drop down. And if you go in there and type in your questions, you can send them and I will see them, and I will try to address them as we're going along or potentially in the question and answer period once I get through the slides. We are recording the presentation, but your information does not appear in the recording, so the list of attendees or anything like that does not appear. We also do not record the Q&A session at the end. So once we go into Q&A, we're going to cut off the recording, and so that section of the event will be available only to those of you that are actually on it live. So with that, I will take a look here, and I wanted to start by telling you that this particular session is not about XML implementation and managing in XML implementation. I have done quite a lot of work on that, and we have some white papers on the issues around implementation. But this particular session, what I want to focus on is what happens after the transition to XML. How does this go, and how does life change? Because, of course, if you've been through the implementation and you've done this work, you might think that, okay, we've got our XML and now we're done, we're home free, we can move forward. And it turns out that that's probably not the case. There are some very kind of specific challenges that you're going to run into that are different in an XML-based TechCom environment than they are in a sort of traditional desktop publishing-based environment. And with that, I wanted to launch my first poll. I wanted to ask you about what you are doing. What is your XML status? So are you already using XML? Are you in the process? Are you thinking about it? You think it's a terrible idea and you're trying to build ammunition here? That would be a legitimate response, or perhaps something else. If you have an other response, I would appreciate it if you would, if you're comfortable with it, share that information in the questions area. So just type in a note that says, you know, this is where we are with it, and give me some idea of what that other might be, and I will share that with the audience. So at the moment it looks like considering is in the lead, but let's see where this goes. I don't expect to see a whole lot of people that say XML is a terrible idea, but you know, you never quite know what might happen. So I'll give you another 5 or 10 seconds or so to go ahead and hit your polling, and then I'll close out the poll and share the results. So here we are with the results, and it looks as though the winner is, in fact, we are thinking about it, followed closely by we are working on it, with we use it already and other a little ways behind. And in the other category, it looks like I have one response here who says, this is from a freelancer, I'm learning more about it basically to then be able to support the customers, I think. Okay, good. So let's take a look at this. If you are considering an XML-based authoring environment, what does that look like? So I want to take a little bit of a step back and talk about the evolution of technical communication. Historically or traditionally, technical communication has been what I would describe as an art or maybe a craft, but an artisanal kind of thing. And what's happening now is that TechCom is evolving from being this sort of craftsmanship kind of model into a manufacturing model. The result of doing this is that you take out inefficiencies in the process. The process becomes much more predictable, much more automated, and perhaps the quality of an individual thing, an individual deliverable within the overall process is lower, but the throughput, the amount of content in our case that you can create becomes much, much, much higher. So you get more stuff, lower cost, and some compromises on quality. That's kind of what you see just generally when you go from an artisanal kind of thing to a manufacturing kind of thing. And you can apply this to lots of things above and beyond TechCom. So if you think for a second about things like pottery, a piece of hand-thrown pottery is going to be significantly more attractive and expensive than a piece of mass market stuff. So that's kind of what we run into there, is that you're going to have a situation where the overall quality is perhaps a little bit lower, but you can get so much more of it, and the throughput is much higher. Now, XML is part of that. What's going on is that XML is becoming part of that evolution. XML is driving or is involved in some of this manufacturing stuff that we're seeing. And I see a lot of questions along the lines of, how can I get out of XML? I don't want to do it. It's icky. It's yucky. I don't like it. I have to tell you, I don't think you're going to win that argument unless you work in a very, very specific kind of organization, and most of us don't. XML is going to give you the ability to evolve your documentation in such a way that the creation of documentation becomes part of the product development and the sort of engineering process. It's not in its own proprietary little world with tools that nobody else could possibly understand. It's using tools that are familiar to the people on the development side, especially if you're in a software organization, and that's just the direction it's headed. Now, when you do this, when you move towards more automation and you move towards more manufacturing, you're going to get compromises. And as you may recall, infamously, when the Model T first came out, you could get it in any color as long as it was black. And that sort of seems to me where we are right now. We're in a situation with XML where you can have anything you want as long as it's, ugly PDF. So we're going to move forward on automation. We're going to save a pile of money because we're eliminating a lot of manual work, a lot of overhead, a lot of just stuff that's not value added. For those of you that have been around a long time, you may have been in the industry back in the day when, for example, you had to build your table of contents by hand. That's not really value added. It's not valuable to spend time building a table of contents if instead you can use a tool to build it and then spend your time on the writing. But a car or a deliverable that is lovingly handcrafted is going to be a lot prettier, potentially, and really, really hideously more expensive. So then we have to start asking some really unpleasant questions about the value of extremely attractive content. I started my career as a production editor, so I spent a lot of time doing things like fixing page breaks and fixing line breaks and balancing pages and copy fitting, all those little tricks that you learn to really make pages look nice and make printed books look nice and make spreads look nice. And the question is, was I really or am I really doing that for my audience? My suspicion is that I was doing that for, me, for somebody who really, appreciates books. And I'm afraid that the reality is that most of the people that are consuming technical content are not book connoisseurs. So we've got this problem that we're trying to evaluate our content in some ways on artistic merit, and the end user, I'm not so sure, really cares. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should have things like a heading at the bottom of a page. I mean, there are some things that are just beyond the pale that nobody should have to tolerate. But, fine-tuning the line breaks, maybe it's not quite worth it if we can instead use XML, produce documentation, get something that's professional and attractive, but maybe not award-winningly beautiful. Now, I keep hearing, and I actually said it earlier, I keep hearing this XML equals ugly content, XML equals ugly PDF. And there's a couple of things I want to say about that, but the first one is that I've seen a lot of ugly documentation in my career in all sorts of tools. I've seen some really ugly stuff that came out of Word, and I've seen some really ugly stuff that came out of FrameMaker and probably every other tool that you can mention. But for some reason, when we start talking about XML, what we hear is XML is ugly, or XML output is ugly. And what I would say is that poor implementation of XML will give you ugly results, but that doesn't imply that XML itself equals ugly. The problem that we're running into is that very few people know how to take an XML file and render it into something attractive. And so as a result, you get people taking XML or maybe DITA, running it out through the DITA Open Toolkit on the default settings, and that is in fact quite ugly. But the same thing is true in, let's say, Microsoft Word. If you take a Microsoft Word file and a default Word template, you're going to get some really, really ugly stuff. So I just want to point out that I've seen ugly across the spectrum of tools and not just within XML. So what's going to happen when you move to XML is that XML is going to change, in my opinion, how you manage a TechCom group. And there are 5 major things that we have to look at here. And I want to take a look at each one of these kind of in turn. So transparency. XML is going to increase transparency of your operation and of your organization. What I mean by that is that your writers will not be able to hide behind formatting tasks. You can't say, oh, you know, I was trying to make the line breaks fall correctly and it took a long time, or this template doesn't really support what I'm trying to do. They are simply handed a set of elements and expected to use those elements. The formatting tasks are abstracted elsewhere, and so as a result, they will just go ahead and write their content. So there's no hiding behind the formatting step because that's been completely automated. Second, because it's easy to review content or easy to review content in progress, you can see progress being made or not, as the case may be. One very common approach in XML or technique in an XML-based authoring environment is to do nightly builds. So I go along as a writer during the day, I write my stuff, and then at the end of the day I check it into the content management system, the build system, the source control system, whatever it may be. And overnight, there's a magic build that runs. It reaches in, it gets my updated content, it renders updated HTML and posts it on an internal review site. Okay, well, that means that my developers or my product managers or my management is going to be able to see every day how much progress I've made. So there's increased transparency in terms of reviewing content and reviewing progress because you can get this sort of incremental progress that you can see. Also, transparency is increased because there are tons and tons and tons of metrics that are going to be available. Lots of different ways of measuring the content and measuring the progress around the content. And I'm going to talk about this in a little more detail, but you actually run into what is really a potentially overwhelming amount of data. And you have to figure out for yourself, for your organization, what is the appropriate measurement, what is the appropriate metric, and what makes a good document. And I can tell you right now, it's not pages per hour. So transparency is actually pretty problematic for certain kinds of perhaps not as good writers because they don't really want people to be able to see how much progress they're making or how much progress they're not making. And you're going to run into a sort of a collision here because evaluating writers on things that are not related to document quality is really easy inside XML. So, for example, inside XML, it's very, very easy to measure something like how many pages did you write, how many new topics, how many new characters did you add to this file. But, of course, that's not actually a valid or useful measurement of quality. So you can run into this really significant problem if you have a non-TechCom manager or a TechCom manager who doesn't really understand technical communication or documentation, who starts measuring the wrong things, and then, of course, when those things are being measured, you know, of course, what people will write to. They're going to write based on what they're being evaluated on. And if that is something like topics per week, then we have a potential disaster on our hands. So the question then becomes, how do you measure high-quality content? What constitutes high-quality content? And there are a couple of different things going on here. First of all, the writing itself. Is it clear? Is it concise? Does it use as few words as possible? Is it appropriate for your audience? Is it at the right level for your audience? Is it accurate? And is it up to date? Is it current with, you know, the product? Formatting. The formatting should be attractive, consistent, and well executed in the sense that it is appropriate formatting for the kind of deliverable that you're doing. And then we have searchable, findable, and discoverable. Now, searchable is actually a policy decision. Searchable is the question of, is your content available to search engines? Is it out there on the internet? Are the search engines allowed to index it? So basically, is it out there in a way where if somebody goes to a search engine like Google and types in search terms, that your content is available to that search engine? That is, in fact, different from findable. Findable is the question of, if I type in a query in the search engine, will I find your content? That's different from, is your content on the internet? You might not find it. And then discoverable is kind of goes beyond that. So discoverable is content that I might find via a link from some other content. So for example, I put a topic out there, another person writes a blog or a forum article that says, you know, blah, blah, this, that, and the other, hey, for more information, go read this topic, and they provide a link. The more links that you have like that, the more discoverable your content becomes. Now, the interesting thing about this to me is that if you look at the things that I've now highlighted in green, those are the things that XML can help you with. So XML is not going to help you with writing well, writing audience appropriately, or writing accurately. Those are writing tasks that the writer has to perform. It can help with up-to-date because it potentially is going to shorten the publication cycle and shorten the amount of time it takes you to publish information or to push it to your audience. Formatting. That entire bullet for formatting is basically green because attractive, consistent, and well-executed formatting can all be automated in your XML-based publishing process. So that piece you should be able to completely automate. And then on that last three, searchable, that's a policy decision. That's something that the organization has to decide to do. Findable implies that it performs well in search results. That is helped by doing things like doing good keywording, organizing it well, and doing some search engine optimization work, which should be part of the author's responsibility and can be supported by an XML implementation. And similarly, discoverable, there's some things you can do with related topics and pushing content out and syndication and some other things that you can have supported by XML. Now, I'm not suggesting that XML will do all the work for you, but it can potentially help. So we have searchable, findable, and discoverable. And the thing I wanted to do here was I wanted to take a look at this and ask you, how visible is your content related to this? So is your content publicly available? And if not, then you sort of have to click that first button. But the others that you have are, is it searchable via Google? Is it findable? Does it perform well with keywords? And is it discoverable, which would be the last one? Does it really turn up because people are linking to it and they appreciate that it's out there and they're making comments about it, basically. So let's give that a minute. And oh, interesting, it looks like about 2/3 of you are saying not publicly available. So for those of you that are saying it is not publicly available, that brings the follow-on question, which I'd love for you to handle in the Q&A section, which is why not? I mean, and if it's classified, military restricted, that kind of thing, or is it a matter of policy? Is it something that you anticipate ever being reversed? If you can, make some comments along those lines if you're comfortable with it, I'd be interested. So, and I'll give this just a minute. And then I will close the poll and we can take a look at the results. Okay, so there we go. 61% say not publicly available, and then it sort of falls off from there, 16, 14, and then 9%. This implies to me that perhaps there is, some work to be done in this area to get it up and running a little bit better. Okay, so let's take a look here. We do have some comments about why it is not publicly available. So So proprietary expensive software, don't want to make the docs available. Not publicly available due to company policy. Fear of competition, I'm going to come back to that one. Docs, this is actually a security answer. Docs for a network configuration don't belong in public view. Somebody else says mostly not electronic. I'm guessing they mean, I'm not sure, but I think what they mean is that their documents are not available electronically. But correct me if I'm wrong. We sell to OEMs, and they take our content and rework it. So in that case, if you're the white label, you would not make it available there. The documentation is for proprietary technology. We do not have the technology and haven't really thought of making it available. Another one that's proprietary. Here's somebody who says it is a matter of policy that is changing. We are working in our group to make the content available. Fear of competition has been the issue, but no more. Very, very interesting. I want to come back to fear of competition. The proprietary thing, which sort of ties into that to a certain extent. If you have competitors, unless you are the military, and even then, your competition probably does have your documentation. If nothing else, they went out and bought a copy, or they pirated a copy, or they found a way to get their hands on the product. So I hear fear of competition a lot, but most of the time I think that in reality, if I'm a competitor, I'm going to find my way to get my hands on it. But I want to talk a little bit beyond that about this searchability and findability issue. Let's assume that I have a product, and we do not make the documentation available. So it's sitting, it's private, it's behind a firewall, you can't see it out on the internet. Now, as a potential customer, I'm searching the internet looking for a particular kind of thing, and instead of finding the official documentation, what I'm going to find is all the third-party stuff that's been written. Maybe a blog, maybe a forum, some stuff that's all over the place, which implies that if people are searching for content, I think that's a given. And the question is, how important is it for them to find your information versus other information? Because they will find something. It's just a question of what are they going to find. So I would think very carefully, and of course this has to be a strategic decision, perhaps a couple of levels up, but I would think very, very carefully about this issue of we don't want our competitors to see it, and the flip side of that, which is your potential customers also will not see it. And which one of those wins is certainly a decision for you to make within your organization, but something to consider there. So I'm not suggesting that you have to change it, but I do think it's something that needs to be thought about very, very carefully. So, yes, and here's a note from the person who said they used to have fear of competition, saying we also protected the online version when we still printed manuals, but we no longer print, so the reason to provide it only to supported customers has also gone away. Yeah. All right, so transparency means accountability. And in case you're wondering, this is a picture of dead coral. So you can't hide behind, as a writer, you can't hide behind formatting problems. As a manager, what you are probably going to see as this goes forward is that, for example, person A takes twice as long on average to create a topic as person B. Or person A consistently has higher costs in localization. Their topics cost more when they go through the translation process. Now, this does not make me very happy if I'm a writer, because now I'm worried about, oh, well, they're going to ding me for having higher cost topics because I worked on a more difficult project. So as a manager, you have to go beyond just perceived efficiency and understand what's really going on. Maybe writer A is writing on a much more difficult product. Maybe writer A's content is 100% new and writer B's content is being reused from an older product. So naturally, writer A would take longer to create their content. Or perhaps writer A is working with a really recalcitrant, kind of obnoxious subject matter expert who's not providing them with the information and support that they need. So beyond just the raw metrics, there has to be analysis of those metrics and an understanding of the situation and a real understanding of what's going on there, not just hey, your stuff is taking longer. So there's some accountability there, but accountability is not just for the writing team, it's also for management to understand the metrics and work through them in a useful way. So you want to be really, really, really careful with metrics. I think that might actually be my overall theme here. There are some really obvious metrics to look at: pages per hour, topics per day, percentage of reuse. Well, if you use any of these are just silly. You're making your writers jump through hoops, and it's just ridiculous because it doesn't tell you whether they're actually generating useful content. So my advice is to stay away from the obvious and really kind of seductive measurements that are easy to measure. But I will warn you, if you measure pages per hour, your page count will increase. If you measure reuse, you're going to see an increase in reuse. It may not be useful reuse, it may not be done correctly, but you will see it increase. So you have to be really, really, really careful about how you do this and what you implement. Now, what are useful metrics? I would back up and start with usage numbers. And this then ties into some of the making your content available. If you are putting HTML content on a web server, and it doesn't actually have to be a public web server, but any web server, even if it's internal to your organization. If you're doing that, you can then put web analytics software on the web server, and you can identify the content that is heavily used, most used, least used. That's going to start to give you some useful information about what content people actually want and what content they are actually reading. You can also look at search patterns. So what kind of searches are people doing, and what kind of searches are successful, and what kind of searches are unsuccessful. And you can use that to then start thinking about what kind of topics to add to your content, what information is missing. There's a person at Semantic, Tristan Bishop. He's going to be doing a session in about a month, middle of July, for us, talking about these kinds of issues. They've done some very, very interesting work there with what they call just-in-time documentation. They look at the search patterns, and then based on the search patterns, they figure out what topics to add, what is the high-priority content that is missing. So that's something to think about. But beyond web analytics, which I think are fascinating, you do need a way to calculate the value of your technical communication content. Now, you can do things like volume and throughput, but you want quality. You want to really understand the quality of your documentation. And so with that in mind, I've come up with a new writing equation called QUACK. QUACK stands for quality, usability, accuracy, completeness, and conciseness divided by cost. So it is those 5 elements. And of course, this is slightly silly, but you know, really what we're looking for here. So what you would do is you would weight each of these factors for your organization. If you are doing, nuclear weapons documentation, then accuracy is perhaps more important. If you are in a very low margin business, that cost denominator may be more important. So let's take a look at each one of these and talk a little bit about how you would weight or perhaps evaluate it and what each one of these is. So quality is the actual quality of the writing. Is it well written? Grammar, mechanics, sentence structure, those kinds of things. How good is the language itself? Quality needs to be weighted more heavily if your audience is of low literacy. So typically there are products in certain industries where you can expect low literacy. If you have English as a second language users, you need to be very, very careful about your writing quality and write very simple, very easily understandable content. That's actually harder to do than just throw out some content. And then the third group where this writing quality is more important is users who are very, very picky. And by that I mean English teachers or whatever the language is that you're dealing with. The people who are just, if you're writing for other technical communicators, you want to be really, really careful about your writing quality because they will bury you if it's not good. Writing quality is going to be relatively less important if you're writing for basically a professional audience that is really not that interested in anything other than getting to an answer. And the default answer I use, or the default example I use here, is API reference documentation that you're writing for software developers. You can get away with writing content that's not maybe so great in terms of quality of language, but there's some other things that the software developers care about a whole bunch. Okay, so then we have usability. Usability is the usability of your content. So now this is going beyond, we've talked about language. This is sort of how is it presented, how pretty is it, how good is the navigation? And it's also a question of things like, did you use a video where a video was needed in order to make it more usable? One example you see here a lot is the text-based instructions that IKEA provides for assembly. There's sort of an interesting usability thing going on there. So usability is, did you pick an appropriate medium to present your message, and did you present the message in a nice way, or how nice was that? This one needs to be weighted heavily for products where motivation is low, products that people choose to use and could choose not to use. So here, the canonical example, in fact, is Apple Computer. They do a lot with usability, and they make it compelling from a usability point of view such that people want to pay them lots and lots of money for a product that you can get for a lot cheaper in perhaps a slightly less usable package. And I think basically you're paying a premium there for the design experience. So usability does not have to be as high. It needs to meet a minimum standard, but it does not have to be as high for, again, a professional audience. For example, if you are making software for professional tax preparers, well, your documentation has to be reasonably good, but perhaps it doesn't have to be incredibly usable, because as part of their job, they must find the information, and so they will plow through it. Their motivation is pretty high. So when you think about usability, you really want to think about motivation. What is the motivation of your group, and where do they need to go with that? Accuracy. How accurate is the content? Again, if you're documenting nuclear weapons, nuclear medicine, medical devices, high-stakes content or high-stakes products where using them incorrectly leads to death, then accuracy is extra important. If you're documenting plants versus zombies, then accuracy in the list of little zombie monsters is perhaps slightly less important. The consequences of getting something wrong in there are minimal. So that's accuracy. Completeness. Have you documented all the features, or are there hidden features that are not in the documentation? Now again, with games, there's a long, long tradition of only documenting enough to get people started and letting people have sort of discovery within the game. As they play, they find certain things and they learn things as they're going along. It's not in the documentation. On level 17, you will go around a corner and there will be a no. You don't do that. You let people run around the corner and get splattered by whatever it is around the corner. On the other hand, completeness is important, especially for regulated industries. Medical devices, for example, are required to be completely documented by the FDA. So you don't want to go around putting Easter eggs into medical devices. And so completeness would score higher for a medical device or other high-stakes kind of product than it would for a headset or something like that. Conciseness. Sorry about the K. Is it more verbose than needed? So this is a question of, did you use as much content as you needed and no more? Because if you use more, then it will cost more money in localization, if you do that, in print, if you print, and also being wordy will lead to comprehension problems. People will have trouble understanding the content, which then in turn lowers the writing quality. But conciseness, I think, gets its own element or its own bullet, because we do worry about that. We do worry about making sure that everybody is, writing as little as possible, but enough. So you don't want to be you don't want to cut yourself off too little, but there you are. So you take all of those things, you weight them within your organization by importance, you add them all together to get some sort of score, and you divide by cost. Now, clearly, if you spend enough money, you can probably get these things to a pretty high level. The question is, how much are you willing to spend, and how much do you need to spend to get your quality to where it needs to be? So that is my quality equation, and I'm actually very interested to see feedback on that, both within this session and also down the road. I think I've captured what you need, but I'm willing to discuss it. I should also point out that everything that is in this presentation is entirely unsupported by research. Somebody asked me where the research was, and I said it does not exist. So that was metrics. Now, when you're writing in XML, it is going to change the skill set that you need for your authors, or the skill sets that authors need to succeed. And basically what's going to happen is that in the traditional desktop publishing or help authoring tool-based approach, you have basically an equal split between writing ability, tools knowledge, and domain knowledge. So how well does somebody write? How well do they use the authoring and publishing tools? How well do they know the technology or the product that they're writing about? And then I gave that last 10% to people skills. People skills are relatively less important because traditionally what's happened is that as a writer, I get handed a book assignment and somebody else gets handed a book assignment. So there's not a lot of overlap, there's not a lot of collaboration, and we just go off and write our own books, and we're responsible for generating those as print or PDF or generating a help system or whatever it may be. The collaboration is typically at a sort of chapter level, at a pretty high level, or it's I own this book or this product set and you own that other book, and we don't have a lot of overlap. What's happening with XML, as you'll see, you see in the pie chart on the right, is that writing ability increases relatively within XML, and domain knowledge requirements increase. Tools get tiny, and people skills get bigger. Why is this? Well, you don't have formatting as a responsibility anymore, so because of that, the tools shrink. You basically only have authoring and not publishing. So tools knowledge actually goes down. Now, there is obviously a learning curve going from my traditional, whatever it was I was using, over to an XML-based tool. But once I'm in XML, it's just elements and attributes, and push a button to get your output. So tools knowledge goes down. Domain knowledge relatively goes up because you have to know more about the product you're documenting, because you're probably going to be held to a higher standard because you can't hide behind the tools. Writing ability, you need to be a better writer in XML. And the reason for that is that you need to write for reuse, you need to collaborate, and you need to play well with others. So you need to write topics that are reusable. And that is actually much, much harder to do than go off and write your own book as a standalone. So that's why I'm arguing that writing ability becomes more important. And similarly, people skills increase because writers have to be able to collaborate. They have to be able to play well together and get along with each other. And yeah, I see a couple of comments in the question section along the lines of, did you really mean that? And the answer is, yes, I really did. I believe that you have to be a better writer on the XML side than on the not XML side. So that brings me to what I think in fact is actually the biggest problem, hurdle, challenge with XML, and that is collaboration. When you go to an XML-based authoring environment, nearly always you're also moving to a topic-based environment. Now, those two things are not technically the same thing, but nearly always people that are moving into XML are moving to topic-based rather than sort of book-based authoring. Now, if they've been in a help authoring tool, they're probably already topic-based, but they perhaps didn't have so much collaboration yet. So we shift to a topic focus rather than a deliverable focus. It's not, oh, I own this book and I'm producing it. It's, oh, I have responsibility for these 27 topics, which then become components of various deliverables. And you find that people will, not everybody, but some people, will look for excuses to avoid reuse. Oh, well, my book is unique and my content is special, and I would love to use your topic, but it really doesn't work in the context of my book. So you get those kinds of things, and sometimes it's true, and sometimes people are just trying to sort of preserve their territory. And so you really get a very kind of difficult collaboration challenge, because when people are accustomed to owning the process from start to finish, and now they're being asked to chop up the process into little discrete bits, all of which are kind of hand-offable, they get very, very nervous. They don't necessarily want that to happen, and so they tend to push back against it. So you want to be careful about this, and I think the important thing here is to be careful about BOSSY. And I know we've got some folks from out of the U.S. BOSSY is a default name for a cow, not unlike Fido or Rover for a dog. BOSSY stands for, in my universe, Book Ownership System Syndrome. And so what I see happening here is that people get into this mentality of, it's my book, and nobody else can do my book as well as I can do my book. And that doesn't work in a topic-based outlook. It just doesn't work at all, because there's not going to be any collaboration then, and collaboration is important in order to, get stuff done. Put 10 writers on one project and see where it goes. So, so that is kind of where I see that going, and so subsequently to that, I of course could not help myself and had to come up with another acronym. And so what you want is not BOSSY, but in fact CROC, which stands for Create Reusable Objects and Collaborate. That is what you are looking for. You want people to go in that direction and really sort of cooperate and go there. So I see some questions starting to come up, so I will just put up my gratuitous animal pictures, and that is sort of the general the general sense of where I'm going with this. And I am going to, a couple other things. The webcast recording will be up probably in about 3 days, and definitely take a look at scriptorium.com events for the upcoming events. We've got some really, really interesting webcasts coming up. So with that, I'm going to cut off the initial presentation here and take a look at the questions and see how those go. So if you have questions or comments or disagreements or anything else, do go ahead and start throwing those in there, and we'll see what we come up with. I see a note here saying collaboration between tech writers and subject matter experts may be an even bigger hurdle, and that is, I would certainly agree with that. Okay, I have a note here that says this is interesting. I disagree about less tools knowledge being needed for XML authors. The Ditto tools I use are considerably more complex than, say, the Adobe TechCom suite, because they're immature and developed for developers, not authors. And I then look at the next question underneath that, the next comment underneath that, which says, I agree tools knowledge for authors will be less important once the XML authoring environment is implemented, but XML is technically complex. How does a small team that cannot afford a dedicated XML tools guru get quality content? Okay, so those are basically the two sides of the coin. Clearly in implementation, you've got huge, huge tools requirements. And also your tools person, I think, has huge tools requirements. But what I'm suggesting is that the generic author will just create content and is no longer responsible for formatting, and therefore has less tools knowledge in the long term. In the short term, as in a transition or an implementation, I could certainly see the point that you need more tools knowledge. But I think what I'm saying is if you take the long view, then there is less tools knowledge needed, because as an author, I'm only responsible for a small portion of the tool chain. However, I think the comment or the point that you're making, Jim, is that if you're responsible for the entire tool chain, then you clearly need more tools knowledge. And I don't disagree with that at all. So I think we're kind of on the same page. We're just phrasing it a little bit differently. Okay, so the next question was, XML is technically complex. How does a small team that cannot afford a dedicated XML tools guru get quality content? He asks the person who does consulting. So my obvious answer is hire a consultant for the short term, get it implemented, get it up and running. If that's not an option, and I certainly understand that it might not be, then you're going to have to look at who within the team is most interested in XML and could handle this and could spend some of their time going down this road.